Well, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be looking at Ruth's story. And I know this may be a familiar story to some of us, but it's a very short book in the Bible, only 4 chapters long. And rather than reading all 4 chapters to you, I thought I would read kind of an abridged version for you. And the story actually starts with another woman, Naomi. So Naomi and her husband were Israelites, and they had 2 sons. They lived near Bethlehem. There came a time when there was not enough food for everyone to eat, and so this family had to move to another country called Moab. While in Moab, Naomi's husband died, and her sons married 2 Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. Before long, though, Naomi's sons sadly died too. Naomi is left heartbroken, and although she loves her daughters-in-law, she feels abandoned by God. One day she heard that there was now food in her home of Bethlehem, so she decided her best option would be to make the journey back again to be possibly near some relatives, no matter how distant they might be. One of her daughters-in-law, Orpah, reluctantly goes, but Ruth refuses to walk away from Naomi. Ruth arguably has more options available to her. She's young and could remarry someone in her homeland, yet she's determined to travel together with her mother-in-law. Once they get to Bethlehem, it is now Ruth who is the foreigner. She goes to glean barley from a field which just so happens to belong to Boaz, who, unbeknownst to Ruth, is a distant relative of Naomi's. Boaz praises how kind Ruth has been to Naomi, who very well could have done differently. And then he himself shows great kindness to her. As the owner of the field, he orders that Ruth is protected and is allowed to not only glean what she's able to find that's been left on the ground, but that the workers are to drop extra on purpose so that she will have more than plenty. One day, Naomi told Ruth to approach Boaz and to essentially ask him to take care of Ruth. So one night, Ruth did just that, and we might think of their encounter as Ruth essentially proposing to Boaz. Boaz again praises Ruth. Not only has she shown kindness and mercy to Naomi, but now he says that she has shown the same kind of kindness and mercy to him. He seems to say that she could have chosen a different husband, yet she chose to be with him. And we have a happy ending. Ruth and Boaz are married and supposedly live happily ever after, and they have a baby called Obed. And Obed will grow up to be the grandfather of King David. So, as I mentioned earlier, today is one of the few stories that really seems to feature women. And this is one of these stories that I have found myself reading in different ways throughout my life. As a younger woman, I can remember as I identified with Ruth as a young woman, thinking of her friendship with Naomi and wondering, could I be that loyal of a friend that just in the time of her being married to Naomi's son, she grew so close and so loyal to Naomi? Could I be that loyal if I were in Ruth's shoes? And then fast forward a few years and I married my husband, Josh. And then when I read this story, I couldn't help but put my own mother-in-law into the role of Naomi. Now, I love my mother-in-law. Don't get me wrong, I really do. But no matter how much I love my mother-in-law, I find myself wondering, could I do as Ruth did? Could I leave my homeland? Could I leave everything I have ever known, all my kin, all my family, and go with Naomi? And now, fast forward a few more years, and I am the mother of 2 sons. And so now when I read this story, I can't help but put myself in the role of Naomi. And I wonder, someday perhaps my sons will have spouses. Would either of their spouses be so loyal to me? Would I be a mother-in-law that people would want to be loyal to? I don't know how one goes about preparing to be a good, lovable mother-in-law. It's funny how when you read a story over time, it changes how you hear it. And this is perhaps a familiar story to many of us, but what part is the most familiar to you, I wonder? Is it the loyalty of Ruth? We might think of her loyalty best when she says to Naomi, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." Or maybe most familiar to you are the feelings of loss. and abandonment that Naomi experiences. Yet even then, she determines to travel back to her homeland. Or maybe the role of Boaz is most familiar to you. Is it Boaz fulfilling the laws of Israel and redeeming an entire family in doing so that would have otherwise been left hopeless? Is it Boaz who seems to foreshadow another descendant, Jesus Christ, who comes to redeem not just one family, but the entire family of creation? We could talk about this beautiful, beautiful story for weeks and its beautiful, happy ending, but I want to make sure that we talk about a few things, especially this morning. And that is that unlikely hero part of Ruth. What is it about her that makes her an unlikely hero? Because I think it is more than just the fact that she was clearly a notable woman for her story to be documented and for her to have an entire book of the Bible for her story in a time where women typically went unnamed, where women were typically only identified as property of a man. Ruth is a Moabite, and we may not hear it so much in this book just of itself, this tone related to being a Moabite, but when we look through all of Scripture, we see that being a Moabite is not something to be proud of. If we were to look at Scripture, we see that being a Moabite, to be a Moabite would be to be an enemy of the people of God. Ruth could have been perceived as an enemy. Animosity existed between the Israelites and the Moabites, Naomi's people and Ruth's people. Looking back at Genesis, we see that the Moabites are distant relatives of the Israelites, yet they're seen as morally corrupt. They are despised. And we see that they failed to provide water and food, hospitality, provisions to the people of God as they left Egypt. They were seen as morally corrupt. And they were enemies. And so when we look at it like this, beloved and loyal Ruth may have been even braver than we initially give her credit for. She may have very well anticipated a not so pleasant welcome to Israel. She may have thought, what will people think of me? And Naomi, for her part, when she tries to talk Ruth into staying behind, as much as she loves Ruth, we can't help but wonder, maybe it crossed her mind, just a flicker crossed her mind, that it might be more trouble than it was worth to have Ruth go back with her. What might people think of her returning with this foreign woman? Throughout Scripture, we find that foreign women are typically looked upon with fear and paranoia. There's a fear that they will somehow corrupt and mislead the men. And so what might people think of this woman returning with Naomi? A few minutes ago, I had invited the kids to think of a time where perhaps they felt nervous or scared to go into a new place, a new situation. And as we grow, as we age, we perhaps feel like we're more in control of where we go. Like I said, I made the decision to go to England, and yet I was nervous. We sometimes feel nervous and scared when we go to new places. New places can bring encounters with what seems strange, what seems bizarre. And yet Ruth is unwavering in her devotion and her loyalty to Naomi. There's a Hebrew word, and my Hebrew is not really existent, but not very good. But there's a Hebrew word, chesed, that can be translated as loyalty, loving kindness, devotion, and mercy throughout the Bible. And it appears throughout Scripture, but it's very, very prominent in the book of Ruth. And this word, chesed, depicts love perhaps a little differently than what we think of as love in our culture. In our culture, when we hear love, we tend to feel more feelings. We think of the associations and the happy feelings we have about someone we love, someone that we're in love with. And yet this word paints perhaps a broader and deeper image of love. This is more about love in action, love lived out. One commentator says that it's God's covenant love enfleshed in human beings. So, while it's notable that many of the characters in this story live out love, Ruth, who could be known as an enemy of the people of God, also embodies this. We see this in Ruth's kindness to Naomi's family and to Boaz. We see this love in action when Ruth leaves everything she's ever known to go with Naomi, to support Naomi, to bring hope to Naomi through her actions. It's not just about feeling love, it is love lived out. Throughout the story of Ruth, we see God's radical loving kindness showing up in the actions of ordinary people. God doesn't seem to appear as a burning bush in the book of Ruth. God doesn't appear as the one who parts the Red Sea. God's love, God appears in the actions of ordinary people like you and like me. And so I wonder, where in our lives have we seen God's radical loving kindness showing up in ordinary, everyday life? A few nights ago in the women's Bible study, we were sharing some stories. Some of the women were sharing stories of where they had seen God active in their lives. Some of the women were sharing stories that they could look back, and at the time they knew God was with them. They could feel God with them. Other women shared other stories where at the time they didn't see God's hand in it, but looking back on it, they did see God's action there in the workings of ordinary people. Ordinary faithful people is where they saw God's love lived out. Where have you seen God's radical loving kindness in your life? Where have you seen blessings appear out of what seemed broken and dead? Where have you seen those blessings that then spilled into the life of your family, spilled into the lives of your friends and of your broader community? This week, I hope that you'll take a moment and ask God to show you, where have those times been? Where has God been active in the ordinary day-to-day life that you lead? And the other thing would be to go back and to read the short 4 chapters, because it really is a beautiful story. Our unlikely hero, Ruth, who entered a foreign land not only as a stranger, not only as a vulnerable person, but as a potential enemy, a potential threat, God used her. God used her and those around her in making wonderful, radical love there, present, out of seemingly nothingness. Despite being a potential threat, God wove her story into the fabric of the story of the faithful for all. We see the descendant, King David, and then we go down a few more lines, and we see Jesus. Jesus, who would be not just a redeemer for one single family, but a redeemer for the entire family of creation, you and I included. And for that, we can say thanks be to God.